So we are now moving into a consideration of what we call the hominoidea, which in Linnaeus's hierarchy is a superfamily, and it includes the apes and humans. Here you see a gibbon, which is often referred to as a lesser ape. You see the skeleton, very long arms, which tells you that those arms are very important in brachiating and swinging and climbing in the trees. Humans, which have a unique skeleton with very long lower limbs compared to the upper limbs because we are bipeds. Chimpanzees and gorillas are semi-terrestrial. Gorillas more terrestrial than chimpanzees, and they spend some of their time in the trees, some of their time on the ground, and when they're on the ground, they are knuckle walkers. They're variations on a single theme. And orangutans, which are restricted to Southeast Asia, to the islands of Sumatra and Borneo, which are virtually strictly arboreal, with very mobile shoulders and hips for posturing themselves in various feeding postures in the trees, and seldom come to the ground, and if and when they do, they really walk on their fists. They're fist walkers, not knuckle walkers. These would be knuckle walkers, these would be fist walkers. And they're not very efficient or very much at home on the ground and much prefer to be in the arboreal habitat. Male and female orangs, by the way, are very different in size. Males are almost twice the size of females and show the greatest level of sexual dimorphism in terms of body size of any of the apes. What are some of the features that people like LeGros-Clark and others have used to characterize the hominoidea? We have no tail. Gorillas, chimps, orangutans, gibbons, and so on do not have tails. We don't have tails. We have a very broad chest, but narrow from front to back. We have a very short, somewhat stiff lower back. It's not flexible like these arboreal aerobatic monkeys, for example, that have long tails. Our shoulder blades are on the back, which allows us to participate in all sorts of movements of this arm. Monkeys and these other primates we've talked about have very narrow chests, and their shoulder blades are on the sides, which allows them to move like this, but very difficult for them to lift their arms. But hominoids have the shoulder blade on the backs of our bodies, which allows for that mobility, which results in highly mobile shoulders. We have highly mobile wrists and highly mobile hips that allow us to do all sorts of things. There's an increasing high ratio of brain to body size. We have the highest brain to body size ratio, the encephalization quotient. And there is a trend towards increasing complexity and size of the brain with increased cognitive abilities. For example, chimpanzees have a very extensive very extensive set of communications and hand gestures and live in very complex societies. Chimps live in multi-male, multi-female groups, which are very strictly organized and have a strict social structure, but very complex behavior. They've begun to make and use tools like termiting sticks or rocks to break open nuts and so on. So there is a much more complex and enhanced cognitive ability within the hominoidea than there were in, say, monkeys, and especially, of course, in prosimians. And a unique feature of the lower teeth, the lower molars, this is a lower molar, a molar in the mandible or jaw of a chimpanzee. This is the cheek side here. This is the tongue side, and this is the front of the tooth and the back of the tooth. And it consists of a number of cusps. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is one cusp back here that's sort of split in two. So there are 5 cusps on lower molars. On upper molars, there are only 4 cusps. So you can easily tell the difference when you pick up one of these fossils, for example, as to whether it's an upper or lower molar of an early hominin. Now, they're also arranged in a particular pattern, and that is called, we mentioned this a couple of times in the course, a Y pattern. And on the tongue side, or the lingual side, is the stem of that Y, and it breaks up into this branch and this branch. And only the hominoidea share that characteristic, which in terms of Darwin's idea of a common ancestor, in the common ancestor, the presence of this Y pattern existed and has been inherited in apes and humans. As I said, apes live in Africa, in Asia, and Asia. Humans live, of course, all over the world. Gibbons are sometimes called the lesser apes because they're smaller bodied. They are pair bonded through life. They have a male-female partner. They don't live in troops. They spend a lot of time, they move around in groups, but they don't have a huge interaction with one another. And males and females are sort of bonded for life. Chimpanzees live in large troops, multi-male, multi-female groups, and are partly, as I said, arboreal and terrestrial, and live exclusively in Africa. Gibbons in Southeast Asia. Gorillas are only African. They live in harem groups, so that you have a large silverback, and you can clearly see this, the silver hair on the back. The silverback is in charge of that harem, and there's a single male and multi-females. Bonobos, or bonobos, live only in what today is called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they are closely related to chimpanzees, of course. They're sometimes called pygmy chimpanzees. They're a little bit more lightly built, as you can see, and they are a classic example of speciation. We've talked about speciation and the fact that something has to separate and prevent the exchange of genes between populations. And in this case, it was the Congo River. And they evolved into an exclusive group known as bonobos, and a different species from the chimpanzee that you're most familiar with. And orangutans, as I said, fruit eaters predominantly who live in Southeast Asia. Gibbons are broken down into 2 groups, gibbons and siamangs. Here you see their distribution in Southeast Asia. They too are losing territory and are under threat of extinction. They are very special creatures that have this special mode of locomotion called brachiation, and are almost exclusively, very seldom come to the ground. They are totally, essentially arboreal creatures. I recently spent some time in Southeast Asia looking at orangutans, at least the orangutans that are common on the island of Borneo, and particularly in the south, in the area known as Kalimantan, which is where Barute Galdikas has been studying orangs for many, many years. And you see a female on the top right with one of her infants holding on to her hair, and as she's moving through the trees, and you get a sense of how mobile those arms are. Their faces have somewhat of a human cast to them, and in fact, in orangutan, in the local language, means old man of the forest. And on the left is a very large male orangutan. They are being threatened by various farming activities, and they're losing their forest at an alarming rate. A lot of their waters have been polluted by mining operations, so that they are a creature that is certainly endangered. Gorillas, the largest of the primates, as I said, can get up to 450 pounds, some of the males. There is a western and an eastern gorilla and a mountain gorilla, which is called gorilla Berenji. And these are probably most familiar to you from the work of the late Diane Fossey and the movie Gorillas in the Mist, and about her attempts to preserve and conserve and look after these gorillas because they were being killed on a very regular basis, to have their hands and feet cut off, which were used in magic by some of the local tribal people. Today, in particular, the country of Rwanda has established a wonderful opportunity for tourists to go and spend an hour in these mountains with the gorillas, as close as I am to this little lectern. They're really the gentle giants. They're not the fierce King Kong-like things that we see in films and so on. And they have been under incredible danger. Now there are anti-poaching units that are preventing people from coming in and poaching and killing these animals. Many of these apes in Africa, chimps and gorillas particularly, but also antelopes and gazelles and all kinds of other animals, are under tremendous pressure, and they're being used as bushmeat. People are killing them and eating them for food. And we've seen the numbers of gorillas diminish dramatically, but with this program of tourism, the Rwandan government sees that they are beginning to reproduce, the numbers of them are increasing. And it is a wonderful opportunity, should you ever have that opportunity, to go and come face to face with one of these 400-pound gorillas. In the lower right, one of the major gorillas, silverback, had been killed and was being carried out. They had cut off its hands and feet, and you can see how tragic that really is. Chimpanzees are maybe the most familiar non-human primate to all of you. They are extremely bright. They are very clever. They are about 98% identical to humans in terms of their DNA, which means that we shared an ancestor, common ancestor with them, some 6, 8, maybe 10 million years ago. So when you look into the eyes of a chimpanzee, and you will see in an accompanying video, a little video I shot, my first encounter with chimpanzees a few years ago with two mothers with infants on their back. You look at them and you really can see yourself reflected in their behavior. They are very complex animals. They have been also unfortunately used for bushmeat in many areas. And the longest term study of primates in the wild was and is under the direction of Jane Goodall, who has been studying chimpanzees as an acolyte of the late Louis Leakey, and particularly in western Tanzania at a place called Gombe, which is another place you can go to under the auspices of the Tanzanian government and walk among these chimpanzees and observe them in the wild and get a real sense of how similar and close we are to the chimpanzees. There are a number of subspecies of chimpanzees that are indicated by the various colors in this map down here. We won't go into the subspecies, but all the way from Rwanda and Uganda in the east over here, stretching all the way across into places like Liberia and Sierra Leone. And there are quite a number of primatologists who are spending considerable amount of time looking at these creatures in the wild and getting a much better understanding of who they are and what their capabilities are. And the bonobos, or pygmy chimps as they're sometimes called, are situated just in that red area in what is called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Chimpanzees have come under, have been used very often as models in medical research at great pain and suffering to these creatures who are taken out of their normal habitats and put into cages and isolated, and have had terrible invasive surgeries and so on done on them. Recently, the National Institutes of Health in the United States has declared that chimpanzees can no longer be used for invasive research because of the tremendous amount of suffering that these creatures have experienced. And finally, I should point out that they are very trainable. As you know, you've seen them in all sorts of movies and television shows and so on. And some people have smuggled them out and had them as small pets, but once they grow up and they get to be large chimps, they're wild and they're powerful, and they're not much fun to have around. And these animals do not belong in someone's home. They belong in the natural habitat, as Jane Goodall has said over and over again. Finally, I could give you a glimpse of bonobos or bonobos, which were recognized, I think, in the 1920s for the first time as a specialized separate species, which is called Panpaniscus, and only in the central part of Africa. They are unique in many ways. They have somewhat reduced sexual dimorphism in body size between males and females. They are not male-dominated like the chimpanzees that I've shown you here, that are found in all the way from Rwanda across to Africa, where they have dominant males. They are male-dominated. There's very high levels of intra-group aggression, and should any chimpanzee from another troop wander in, that chimpanzee will be attacked, killed, and partially eaten. With bonobos or Panpaniscus, it's very different. They are female-dominated. They are a matriarchal society. And if aggression does begin to come to the surface, for example, in competition for food or territory or just being purely aggressive, females will encourage a high level of sexual activity. And between females and females, males and males, and so on. And they have been called the sexiest primate in the world, and that the motto for them is often "make love, not war." And what that does is it reduces the aggression in the group, and they get along with one another, and the aggression disappears. A very unique and interesting group of primates, chimpanzees, bonobos, now much better studied than ever before, but again facing a terrible threat in terms of bushmeat and loss of territory. So I hope you've enjoyed this very brief overview of primates and has given you a better impression of how we fit in to that mammalian order.